Chapter 4. More than one man stole glances at Chip Connor's battered face while he was eating dinner that day with Pat and his friends. The puncher had taken his beating like a man. He was so little sensitive about his appearance that he insisted on returning to the street afterward. They were standing in the gangway of the livery barn when Connor noticed Pat's attention fixed on something up the street. He glanced that way and immediately discovered what the other was looking at. Chad Hanlon's had driven to town in its glistening buggy, and the rancher hauled up before the general store and stepped down importantly and tethered his smart bay at the hitchings rack.
"Looks like a prosperous man oozing around in that rig,"
Sam Slode commented.
"Well, that's the general idea,"
Connor seconded curtly in regarding Hannon with compressed lips.
"And he pretty near gets away with it, too."
Starting up the street, Hannon failed to notice the quartet. He swung past a saddle and harness shop only to pause before a small dressmaker's establishment. It was then that Pat observed the splendid girl riding in astride a spirited mare. The animal's well-curried hide was a gleaming dark red, seemingly chosen to match the girl's neatly combed auburn hair. She wore trim khaki riding pants and polished boots and a frothy white shirtwaist with a scarlet kerchief. Even at this distance, Pat was struck by her athletic pose in the saddle. Her slim and compact body was molded to an uncommon perfection. But it was the tilt of her head and an unconscious pride of spirit in the finely chiseled face that held his gaze as the girl drew up before the dressmakers.
"Mighty high-class filly,"
Ezra rumbled, wagging his head. Pat's glance fixed as he saw the girl pause, still mounted, while Chad Hannon stepped forward to speak to her. Taking the reins, Hannon looped them over the wooden rail for the girl, and with an off-handed chivalry, he extended a hand for her to help dismount. She ignored it, swinging down with lithe grace, and stood facing him almost defensively, her short quirt swinging from her wrist. In that brief moment, Pat had time to note the possessive smile on Hannon's darkly handsome features.
"Who would that be?"
he murmured to Connor, anticipating the answer.
"That's Marion,"
Chip answered tightly.
"Marion McLennan. Chad must have been expecting her. He's up to his old tricks."
They watched the pair exchange a few words, intent on no one but themselves. Both were the kind that lived life to the hilt, and Hannon appeared to be urging something with smooth persistence, and the girl's sturdy posture was suddenly challenging. She whipped out a few words, and coldly furious, and Chad opened his lips, and his reply must have been more than she could take. In an instant her slim arm rose and fell sharply, and the watching men saw the lash of her quirt curl around Hanlon's face. Chad staggered back and threw up an arm, and Marion took an angry step towards him but didn't strike again. A shock ran through Chip Connor's tall frame. "Why, damn him!" he choked. He started forward, only to be halted by Pat's arresting hand. "Hold on," the latter muttered. He had seen Sheriff Hardwick's broad-shouldered form moving forward through the passer-bys who had stopped to stare at Hannon and the girl. "Doesn't seem like there's any reason to get mixed up in that, Chip." Connor subsided, transfixed like the others, as Hardwick's gruff tones carried to them. Now, what's going on here?" the lawman inquired, grasping Hannon's arm authoritatively. Marion McLennan, according to him, no notice whatsoever. Her fiery regard was fastened unwaveringly on Chad's astonished and chagrined face. "You've overstepped yourself, Chad Hannon." Her scornful words drifted clearly to the listeners. "If there's any doubt in your mind, this is notice that I no longer know you. And please remember not to presume on the fact that I've been rather careless about that matter in the past." With a final swish of her curtain skirts a-swaying, Ignoring every other person in the street, she strode round the end of the hitching rack and disappeared through the door of the dressmaker's shop. "Danged if she didn't tell him off to the Queen's taste," Ezra burst out admiringly. Pat saw Hannon and the sheriff exchange a few curt words in Hardwick's manner cold and determined. Chad finally swung away impatiently, a hangdog look on his face. A moment later, he stamped into a saloon. Pat's glance was speculative, flicking Chip Connor's hard-set features. "So that's the girl that Hannon's so sure of?" He sounded faintly amused. "What do you suppose set that explosion off?" Chip's eyes met him squarely. "I may be wrong, but I'll bet $1 I could quote you what passed, almost word for word." Pat's look was inquiring. "I named the cards Hannon thinks he's holding," Connor went on. "I'm saying he asked Marion to take a ride with him in his flashy rig, and she told him she'd rather discuss buying the Anvil from him. The nervy dog probably said, 'Marry me and I'll give you the ranch.'" "That don't sound at all unlikely." Pat's brows rose. "And?" "Well, she fed him the whip." Chip ground the words out. "Blast him, if I'd been her, I'd have cut him to shreds." Pat's attention was fixed more on Connor's remarkable reaction to the incident than on the likelihood that all had occurred as he had said. The puncher's face was flushed and his dark eyes were flashing. "Pretty well made up your mind on Hanlon, haven't you?" Pat commented lightly. "It's time someone called to turn on that skunk," Chip growled. None of the three had informed Connor it was from Chad Hanlon's lips that they had first learned the charge of beefing H&M steers directly against the puncher. It was unlikely his hatred for his former employer sprang from this cause. Hanlon had already demonstrated his caliber. He was unquestionably a low character, but few men actively hated one another for such a reason. Pat wondered what the true cause would be. He was still thinking the matter over an hour later when, having left the other three at the stable, he walked up the street alone. It was natural that his thoughts should dwell on the Anvil's arrogant owner while he remained in this country, but he was honestly surprised on turning in at the Golden Girl he bumped into the man himself. Hannon paused in the swinging door, stowed and assured. "Well, here you are, Stevens." He nodded heavily. "I was bothered about your pulling away from my place so quick. No hard feelings, I reckon. How about a drink?" They stepped up to the bar, and Pat was under no illusions concerning the rancher's opening, and he waited calmly for what was to come next. If Hannon was uncomfortably conscious of the faint red welt across his leathery cheek, he made no reference to it. He tossed off his drink and set the jigger aside decisively. "Well, I've been turning over that offer of yours of my place," he announced. "Is that still open?" "Well, subject to the confirmation of the title, Hanlon, it is," Pat told him quietly. "You wouldn't consider offering an increase, say $6,000? "Oh, yeah, based upon satisfactory proof of your estimate that you're running 500 head of Anvil steers, I might," Pat allowed casually. Chad frowned. "Well, the count might run 75 or 100 under that." He appeared to prefer leaving the matter vague, toying with his empty glass. "I guess the town clerk's office is open." "Good," Pat nodded. "We'll just step down there." They found the clerk's office in a weathered frame shack at the head of the street. A gray-haired man in shirt sleeves obligingly dug amongst his records. "Title to the Anvil seems to be reasonably clear. One $300 first mortgage against the property is all I can find." "And that covers the actual indebtedness?" Pat asked. Helen nodded, and he looked at Pat expectantly. 500 is still my offer," the latter said. "But I'll make a deal, Helen. If all the steers over 400 the first roundup shows will be applied against the amount of that mortgage. If the count runs under that, the mortgage is yours,
Is that a bargain?" They moved out of the clerk's stuffy office, discussing it. Hanlon appeared both reluctant and tempted. No doubt he was well enough aware how far under his own estimate the Anvil count would run. "We'll close it the way you want, Stevens," he said at last. "As a matter of fact, I'm over a barrel just now, and the money will be welcome." "How's that?" Pat asked politely. "I want to go into another deal that calls for more cash than I happen to be able to swing at the moment. Sale the ranch, it'll give me a free hand. Later on, I'll be able to look around for a larger spread." Without mentioning details, he made it all sound like big business. It was a considerable change from the way he was talking the previous day, and it certainly did not coincide with all that Pat had seen of the man. But Pat was content to pass over the bluff, even if it could not affect his own affairs in any way. "I suppose you'd like an appointment in another day or two for a transfer settlement," he said. "Here in town all right?" "Why, no need for that. Just come on over to the bank." Chad was brisk. "We'll settle the whole matter right away." It was unusual, but Pat was perfectly willing, placing his own interpretation on Hanlon's haste to deposit of the Anvil for hard money. He had deposited his bank draft on the morning of his arrival in El Castro. The amount was more than sufficient for his present needs, and the funds were available. He made out a check for $5,000. "You're carrying the deed with you, I expect?" He shrugged, hardly believing this to be the case. Hanlon produced it from a pocket. "Had it right with you," Pat smiled. "You intended to get rid of the Anvil today to me or somebody." Hanlon's unguarded glare told Stevens that Connor had guessed right about the man's brazen offer to Marion McLennan, and Chad passed it over with a shrug. A notary of transfer was made up on the back of the deed, pending registry at the town clerk's office. Pat accepted the document, making him the sole owner of the Anvil Ranch, and handed it over his check. "I'll just take your note to cover the mortgage, contingent on the roundup count," he said pleasantly. But here Chad stalled. For some reason, he didn't want to handle the matter that way. "Tell you what, step down to Sable's office with me," he proposed. "Mart holds the mortgage. I'll hand him my check to cover the debt, and you can deposit to my account the price of any steers you find over. That way we'll clear the title for you right from the start. How's that sound?" If he seemed to be going out of his way to perform a needless favor, Pat could find no fault with the arrangement. They found Mart Sabo in his store. The merchant was frankly surprised at Hanlon's anxiety to take up the mortgage out of hand, but Pat assured him that Chad was good for the amount, and Sabo had no choice but to accept, and the mortgage was vacant forthwith. "Well, now we're all square, Stevens," Hanlon remarked crisply in the street, and paused. "That is, till you made your count. Reckon you'll take possession immediately. I'll have my stuff out tomorrow. Good luck." "You can send up a rep if you want." Pat nodded. "You'll be in town?" "I'll let you know when I'm ready to start." Chad appeared far from anxious to check the count closely, however. "Skip it," he smiled, turning away. "If you find it necessary to make a deposit, you might mention it the first time we meet." "You're not expecting any deposit, mister," Pat thought to himself, watching the other walk away. Without delay, he went down to the town clerk's office, intending to register the transfer of the ranch. The place was closed. Pat looked at his watch. It was after 4 o'clock. He paused. Had Hanlon maneuvered it so that as to achieve this result? Chad had spun out the talk at Sabo's in no hurry to close the final transaction, and then suddenly he was all for getting away. What could his object have been? Pat shrugged, turned down the street. He did not immediately locate his friends. His room in the boarding house, which he had invited Chip Connor to share, he found unattended. Sam and Ezra's room down the hall was likewise empty. Pat found the trio a few minutes later in the downstairs bar, and they broke off their laughing banter to gaze at him, attracted by something in his manner.
Uh-oh, Sam jibed. You been up to something. What is it this time, Stevens?
You're right, Chip, Pat spoke to the puncher. Hanlon was hanging fire. He made up his mind to dispose of his ranch today one way or another. And he did, he concluded simply.
You mean you bought it?
Sam thrust in.
You was talking to him all this time?
The Anvil's mine, lock, stock, and barrel. We closed the deal about half an hour ago.
Are you sure it's ironclad?
Ezra demanded thinly. Pat smiled. Copper riveted, he declared. I saw to that. Even removed the mortgage that Hanlon must have slapped on to pay for some high-class buggy he was sporting. They talked over the purchase at length. I don't think you'll be sorry, Stevens, Connor said. I wrote you the Anvil was a sweet little outfit. It is. Properly run, it'll pay for itself many times over. I asked Hanlon a lot of questions, Pat nodded, but I couldn't remember everything. What kind of crew did he work?
3 hands right now, was the reply. You saw Nico Santos, and then there's Ep Stack and Charlie Bain.
And how are they? Are they any good?
Chip shrugged. Well, I wouldn't let Nico go.
I see. Pat's eyes twinkled. Time enough for that when I get out there. Won't be long. There's a small chore here in town in the morning, and then I'll be off. He turned to Sam and Ezra. Go buy your horses, he told the two. Drive 'em back to the Anvil, and we'll see about getting 'em back home. Connor, he'll help you.
Sure.
Chip was all readiness.
You 3 are getting to seem like my own folks. Need exercise anyway before I stiffen up.
He grinned ruefully, rubbing a sore shank. Pat liked the light-hearted way in which he accepted his misfortunes.
Might as well get started right off, Sam said. We can make 18 to 20 miles before dark.
He and Chip started to lug their effects downstairs while Ezra went for the horses. In the formality of this town, no one made anything of their preparations on the boarding-house porch. Once the pack horse was ready, the 4 retired to a hash joint for an early supper, and there was a considerable amount of joshing amongst them. Sure you got everything? Pat asked as they walked back to the waiting horses.
Reckon so,
Sam replied. Did you pick up that new rope in the corner by my bed? Inquired Ezra. We'll need it handling a bunch of them ringy horses. Sam and Connor exchanged looks.
I don't remember seeing it, the former admitted.
I'll run up and make sure, the puncher spoke up obligingly. He started for the stairs while Pat and the partners moved towards the bar for a parting drink. Connor was gone for quite a while. Pat heard a door or two slam through the hall. No one thought anything of it when Chip came thumping downstairs with the new rope over his arm.
Good thing I looked, he observed, downing his drink. How about her, boys? Let's go.
He was all haste to see that they got started off, and Pat stood on the steps a few minutes later, watching them jog up the street. They waved and were gone. Pat spent an hour watching the ore freights pull in, and he never tired of watching the Amp Skinners tool their long teams round a corner and swinging into a livery yard. The downstage pulled in with a flourish, and El Castro showed a brisk return to life as business ceased for the day. It was dark when Pat returned to his room. Chad Hanlon's rig still stood in the street, but Marion McLenn's red mare had long since disappeared from the rack from the dressmaker's. There was no one in town in whom Pat was particularly interested in. He entered his room and felt around till he located an oil lamp, and a match flared, and a light grew as the wick caught. Pat sat down on the edge of the bed. It was in his mind to go over the deed to the Anvil Ranch in detail, and he rummaged in his saddlebag for the paper. He had thrust it in there for safekeeping after finding the town clerk office closed. His fingers did not immediately encounter the deed as he groped around, and he leaned down. It was not where he had thought, and he rummaged through the other bag with increased impatience. And then, after a long pause, he sat back and placed his elbows on his knees and thought about it soberly. Once more, on impulse, he went through the bags with the same result as before. There could no longer be any question of the unjarring truth, which forced itself on him with redoubled impact as he sat there. The document had disappeared.